Well, it's great to have you here today, Roosevelt, for this edition of Scala's Love of Learning.
Thank you, Margarita.
Roosevelt, when I first met you, we connected immediately because we both have an Ivy League pedigree along with a Hispanic background. And seeing that you were a professor of English and American Studies, but also the head of the core curriculum at Columbia, I invited you to participate in several events through Scala, which is the nonprofit I started to promote classical liberal arts education for all. And what I'm hoping to do in our conversation today is just share with a wider audience some of the conversations you and I have had over the last few years. And the central question I wanted us to focus on today is this common critique when I talk about liberal arts education that people say, well, that's elitist. That's for the privileged. And in some ways, as you and I have shared, we both did feel very privileged in our education, but we have a passion to share what we have learned with a broader public.
Mhm.
So I wondered if you could just, start us off a little bit with your personal biography, how you came to the United States and how you came to fall in love with liberal arts education.
Sure. Uh, Thank you, Margarita. It's a real pleasure to be here, to be chatting with you. And it's a real pleasure to kind of um, be again on the Scala boats, that is, be again helping promote this mission, which I take to be quite critical and quite critical in our moment, in moment in history, moment in social history, this idea of promoting liberal arts for all. And you and I are living examples of the fact that liberal arts is appropriate for all and not just for a privileged elite. As you said, I'm Dominican. You didn't say I'm Dominican, but I'm Hispanic, and I am from the Dominican Republic. I was born there. Um, I grew up there as a child, and then came to the United States at the age of 12, not speaking English, um, being raised by a single mother with my older brother. And, I went to the zoned public school in New York City, what the middle school that was in my neighborhood, and then the high school that was in my neighborhood. And by really extraordinary good fortune, ended up at Columbia as an undergraduate. And there I encountered Columbia's core curriculum. That is a required set of courses, sometimes called a great books program because there is such an emphasis on old classical texts, books that are sometimes called great books. But there's also art and music. Um, and that was just a really life-changing intellectual experience. And, I say an intellectual experience, but I say it's life-changing because it didn't just change my brain. It changed my life. It changed the way I look at the world, and it gave me this sense of the importance and power of a liberal arts education, and also a sense of mission. It has become really for me the organizing principle in my professional career, my academic career, my intellectual life, to deepen and promote an understanding of liberal arts education, and as the Scala's Foundation mission puts it, for all. That is breaking down the barriers of exclusivity that have sometimes been thrown up around liberal arts education as a way of precisely reinforcing class and privilege, and and preventing others from the kind of empowerment and opening that a liberal arts education can produce.
So, could you tell us a little bit about what is the content of this core curriculum that you encountered at Columbia, and why would people charge that the contents of the core curriculum are elitist and reproduce privilege, especially with regards to minorities or immigrants or African Americans? Where does
Sure.
where does this charge come from?
Yeah. Well, first, let me describe a little bit what the content of the core curriculum is. There's a year-long course in literature that every first-year student takes, and it begins with Homer's Iliad, kind of going back as far as we can in the loosely defined Western tradition of literary expression, Homer, the Greek playwrights, the Hebrew and Bible and the New Testament, coming all the way to the present, so that we end up reading at the very end of the year contemporary novels. Currently, it's Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon that caps the curriculum. Then there's another year-long course that does the same thing for, broadly speaking, philosophical texts, beginning with Plato, following with Aristotle, Augustine, Aquinas, Cicero, ancient philosophers, coming into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and coming all the way to the present, grappling with fundamental philosophical, ethical, social questions. Course in art that does a similar thing, beginning with the Parthenon in Greece, studying the most significant compositions and significant works and artists in the, again, loosely constructed Western tradition. And of course in music that does the same. These courses have been in place for about 100 years. So they come from a period in the history of higher education where higher education was indeed only for the few and the privileged. That is, there is a historical association between not just liberal education, but higher education and privilege. That is, it used to be that college education was only for the privileged, that college education was elitist in that sense, that only the already privileged who came into the world with inherited privilege had access to it. In America, that meant access to liberal education, because until the late 19th century, early 20th century, education in the United States, higher education in the United States, was the same as liberal education. So because higher education was available only to the few, and because higher education was essentially liberal education, there is a historical association between liberal education and privilege. The great story of higher education, a story that we are in a moment of, it's under threat, but the story of American education has been the story of an ever widening field of access of higher education to more and more people. And that has also meant a wider field of access to liberal education, which is how you and I were able to get a liberal education, and how today we need to continue to fight for liberal education to be available to all.
Why is it a fight? I mean, if this was the curriculum, it's been at Columbia for 100 years, if this used to be the standard curriculum for higher education, and then higher education, I understand it as a result of the civil rights movement, began to democratize and began to open its doors to people who previously hadn't been included. Why is it a fight to maintain the curriculum that was once considered the curriculum for an educated person to have? Why did the standards suddenly, or not so suddenly, change?
Yeah. Well, there are at least two big sources of pressure on liberal education, and you can tell the story at many different levels of complexity, but at a fairly high level of complexity, there are these two big forces. One is an increased vocationalization of education, that is, an increased emphasis that education ought to be practical, that education ought to be about professionalizing, about making a career. And we see that everywhere. There is a shrinking of funding and availability for liberal arts, an emphasis on technical education, vocational education, pre-professional education. And that is a large, broad cultural phenomenon. We live in a free market society where values of productivity, efficiency, and the cash value of everything is front and center. So there is a kind of fight against the cultural stream. So that's one big source of resistance. Another is more kind of cultural and ideological. There are people who feel that a traditional liberal arts curriculum is not appropriate for the kind of diversity that we have in our student body. That is that as we have had more minorities, more immigrants, more people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, more first generation students, more women, that that curriculum, that education is no longer appropriate for that population. And I am sympathetic to that, and I can see how intuitive that notion is. But there is a very profound danger, a danger that sometimes I associate with a kind of condescension that says that these thinkers that have been so influential in shaping our contemporary world are not really accessible, do not really speak to the human experience of our diverse student body. And that is just a fundamental misconception.
Let me just pause there for a second to repeat that, because that's an extremely important idea. You said that there's an idea that the ideas of the authors in the core curriculum are somehow fundamentally inaccessible to minorities or to women, and that you're both sympathetic to a certain extent, but also think it's fundamentally misguided. Did I understand that correctly?
That is absolutely right. Let me give you, I'll give you two examples. One is my own. When I read figures like Plato and St. Augustine and Montaigne, they connected with some of the profoundest parts of myself. And I saw myself reflected in those writers, not because they were Dominican, not because they shared my cultural heritage, but because they shared something of my own human experience and illuminated it in a particular way. I also connect with writers that are from my own cultural background, but not at the expense or exclusively those writers. A second example, it's a student I had a couple of years ago. I every summer I teach in a program for rising high school seniors. So this summer between junior and senior year, and they are all low-income students from low-income families whose families didn't go to college. So they will be the first ones to go to college in their family. I had a student, a girl from Harlem, who had grown up in foster homes, whose mother had, drug addiction problem, just about as tough a circumstance as you can imagine growing up in. Well, this really extraordinary young woman shows up in the classroom, and we read Socrates' Apology and Credo of Socrates, and she found herself affirmed and spoken to by the figure of Socrates. And she ended up going to liberal arts college. She graduated a year ago with a major in philosophy, receiving prizes at graduation that explicitly compared her to Socrates, right?
Wow.
She saw in that figure and in that intellectual experience a profound sense of affirmation. Those are just examples of the way in which the power that these ideas, figures, texts have is not circumscribed by class or culture. The reason why they are important is precisely because they transcend the limitations of class and culture from which they come. My contemporary students, Italian Americans, they don't have a special insight into Dante. Dante doesn't speak to them in some peculiar way that it doesn't speak to me because I'm Dominican. That's just simply not the case.
So what I heard you saying just now resonated with what you said when you gave a Scala seminar for students in my home a couple of years ago. And you were rather, controversially saying that in some ways a liberal arts education is elitist. If by elitist we mean that there's a standard of excellence and that the works on the core curriculum in Columbia in philosophy and literature are in some ways excellent, which makes them elitist, excellent, precisely because they do what you just describe. They transcend, they might depart from an historical experience, right? For example, you have mentioned Augustine's Confessions. It's a personal narrative. It's a spiritual autobiography of a learned man who converts to Christianity. But at the same time, that very personal experience of his transcends time, place, religion, race. And that's what makes it excellence. So that to me is the key to what you are saying, because Dante, for example, which you mentioned, I have picked up on recently because I have never read it. And your point was that one may have a connection to Italy or Italian American culture, and it may give you an insight onto Dante. But what makes Dante excellent is precisely that it transcends. Now, he's Italian. He was famous for writing in the Italian vernacular and not Latin, and he was innovative in many ways. Right. And he was very much a contemporary of his age, but he also transcended that. So what you're saying is that a work can both be grounded in a particular experience and transcend that experience. And it's when those two qualities are present that a work becomes excellent, not in an exclusionary sense of elitism, but in a sense of elitism that recognizes that certain works do that better than other works.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, another example of that is Toni Morrison, right? Who's the author that now caps the literature course in the core curriculum. Toni Morrison is rooted in a particular history, right? A history as a Black woman in America, descendant of slaves. And the thing that makes Toni Morrison an extraordinary author, a world-class author, is not the particularity of her experience, but her capacity to convey that particularity in a way that somebody who does not share it is able to grasp the humanity of it, right? That somebody who does not have slave ancestor, who is not American, who is not a woman, who is not Black, can read Toni Morrison and grasp the human experience that she is describing. That is, that she is able to make the particular case in terms that are universal, in terms that are universally accessible. And that is excellence, right? That is what makes Toni Morrison an extraordinary author, an author that is an example of artistic literary excellence. Now, you know, there is a direction of critique that says that there is no such thing as excellence in, say, literature, excellence in cultural productions, that all value judgments of excellence are in fact ways of coding certain forms of power and privilege. I think that critique we need to take seriously, because indeed there have historically been forms of exclusion, of power reinforcement that are built around notions of excellence. But it always seems to me that we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. That is, that we can get some of those insights and heighten our critical awareness of the ways in which the discourse of human excellence has been used to reinforce certain power structures without giving up the notion of human excellence. In fact, we cannot give up the notion of human excellence, because even to critique a form of power is to invoke a higher ideal, and from that basis critique an unjust distribution of power. So we cannot make any kind of judgment unless we hold some idea of excellence, some idea of the good. And a liberal education is precisely a kind of education that concerns itself with investigation of the notion of human good and human excellence.
So again, to kind of pull out what I hear you saying,
yes,
right, is that because the notion of excellence has been used in an exclusionary way, in some people's minds, excellence and exclusion have become synonymous. But what you're saying is that we can acknowledge that the standards of excellence around knowledge have been used to exercise power and exclusion, but we can therefore refine or broaden the criteria of excellence without throwing it out entirely, because the risk of throwing it out entirely is to say that there's no way of judging what is good
Right.
for the human mind. And that
That's
just
right.
sounds kind of strange. That's not really what we do. And I think with the example you gave a moment ago of Toni Morrison reminded me that when you showed me the curriculum, the core curriculum in philosophy and literature at Columbia, although it begins with, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates, it moves up into the present. And so there have been in the core curriculum, when people hear the core curriculum, they hear things like it's never changed or it's never adapted. But in fact, Toni Morrison can be on the core curriculum as an example of an excellent work of literature, and therefore put next to these great books because it has the same criteria. And so showing students that newer works can match up to these criteria is a way of showing that their experience, regardless of what it is, can also rise to the level of excellence that they might find in Virgil or Augustine. And I think the woman that you talked about earlier in our conversation from Harlem, to let her know that yes, her mind is capable of achieving the excellence of these writers from 2,000 years ago. I mean, that's incredibly energizing,
Yeah.
I find, for students to tell them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, there is no ultimate or final list of essential works. We are always tinkering. We're always discovering new things. There are too many, right? And when we choose a set of works that we're going to organize a liberal education around, it's always a provisional set of works. It's always a tentative, a version. And we should, and Columbia does, always be rethinking what are the books that are most effective in conveying the kind of human cultivation, in promoting the kind of human cultivation that we are after. Let me give you an example, a historical example. Coming out of the American Civil War and the abolition of slavery in the late 19th century, there's a great kind of foundational debate between the two most prominent leaders in the African American community. W.E.B. Du Bois, a kind of classically trained intellectual, and Booker T. Washington, a figure who himself was born into slavery and has an extraordinary personal story of overcoming adversity and achievement, just a remarkable figure. They have a very famous debate because Booker T. Washington thinks that coming out of slavery, the free African-American population ought to focus on practical education, on economic self-sufficiency, on developing, even if segregated, but autonomous zones of empowerment, even if that means accepting a second-class citizenship. W.B. Du Bois is entirely against that notion. W.B. Du Bois says, no, we need the highest kinds of education, not just practical education, but also liberal education for our youth coming out of the African-American community. We must insist on our human equality, and our human equality means that tradition of learning, that tradition of liberal education, that liberatory tradition also belongs to us. He says famously, I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. That is, Du Bois finds that Shakespeare is as much his own as it is of the white classmates he has at Harvard or the white German colleagues that he had when he was studying in German. There is for Du Bois a universality about the tradition of intellectual classical learning that empowers the liberatory project of civil rights and citizenship equality in the United States, right? So that's an example there where Du Bois adopts and deploys a tradition that has excluded him and his people to as the tools for liberation.
Well, let's stay on this point for a moment, because I think it's extremely important, right? Getting back to your biography and to my biography, for me, I mean, I'll never forget walking through Phelps Gate and entering Yale's campus and being just overwhelmed at the tradition of this institution. And in some ways, not feeling entirely like I fit in. I didn't have a prep school education. I didn't feel I could compete with so many of the people around. But yet there was this shared excitement about inquiry and about learning. And I relished the fact that I was now meeting, my first Jewish friend who became my roommate and was one of my closest friends. And I did meet people from the very wealthy upper class that I didn't even realize existed. I met other people from a working class background, and I also met other people from Hispanic backgrounds and African American. And so I was exposed truly to a kind of racial, economic, social diversity that I had not seen in my hometown. But yet, our educational experience was something that bonded us together, not annihilating those differences, but in some ways in spite of them. So I want to kind of stay on this point that you made from W.E. Du Bois about Shakespeare belonging to him as an African-American man, as much as it might belong to someone of Anglo-Saxon Protestant descent. So in your experience teaching, because you've taught in the core curriculum, what is it about these great works? What is it about this shared love of learning around great texts that is actually capable of creating a sense of unity among students, not a sense that that's annihilating their personal experience or their differences, but what is it? Tell me a little bit more. What is it about these great texts that can actually create the kinds of friendships and communities and shared excitement about learning?
Yeah, there are a number of things that come to mind. One is that the question, what is a classic? What makes a work of fiction or philosophy or just art a classic? And a lot of people have grappled with this, and it seems that the consensus boils down to a classic, the notion that a classic is a work that people continue to find meaningful a long time after it was written or created. Which is just kind of a very basic notion. That is, there are some works that generation after generation have proved their capacity to illuminate our own humanity, have proved their capacity to enrich and give depth to our own experience of our lives. And so that is a kind of I don't know, a kind of empirical, a kind of historical proof of what works those are. And of course, it's a very loose proof, because it means, sometimes works are rediscovered. There are sometimes works that go through 200-300 years of incredible popularity and significance, and then kind of die out, and then they return, right? So it gives you a loose definition, but some of the things that those works have in common include what we discussed, the capacity to transcend their individual circumstances and speak to a broader notion of humanity. They have a certain complexity that makes them irreducible to ideological manipulation. That is, they have a complexity that makes them multifaceted. They have the fundamental capacity to, as I said, illuminate questions that are broadly human. These works are the works through which we learn the meaning of our own humanity. These are works that encourage us and equip us to become more fully ourselves. Right. Those are the works that have a claim to lie at the center of a liberal arts education. One more point, which has to do with commonality. Part of what's special about the Columbia core curriculum is that all of the students, and Columbia is a fairly diverse student group, that is diverse socioeconomically, not as diverse as I wish it was, but still pretty diverse, especially compared to very elite institutions. It's diverse socioeconomically, culturally, racially, religious background, national background. You get all of those students reading the same books that are trying to grapple with fundamental human questions. And you put students reading those books, grappling with fundamental human questions in the same room to talk about the same text. And it is just an extraordinary intellectual experience. It's an extraordinary social experience because, I always think that that is the place where we can realize the promise of diversity, right? We don't just want a campus that is filled with many different kinds of people. We want a campus that is filled with many different kinds of people who then interact and mingle around their human commonality. And that's what the classroom, the liberal arts classroom, provides around these nodes of humanity that the texts are.
Right. I think, to build on what you're saying, I think what happened to me, maybe what happened to you, what happens to the students that we've worked with is that our own conscience, our own deep subjectivity grows by encountering these works from the past. But those works from the past become a part of our identity. They pass back into our conscience, into our notion of ourselves, not in a way, as I said, that eradicates our individuality, but rather expands our identity in order to be able to find modes of connecting to other people. So we become more truly ourselves in our totality as human beings by encountering these works, at the same time that we learn how to encounter other human persons who are in some ways objectively different from us, right? They're separate from us, but also have within them that core of a human conscience and a human identity. So I think it's important to not, when you're talking about liberal arts education and privilege and class, just simply to make the distinction that one social location, whether that's an advantaged one or a disadvantaged one, is not deterministic of one's moral conscience. Mm-hmm. And once you've made that distinction, you can see that regardless of the social position from where one comes or where one is headed, there is a deeper element to our humanity. And what's the point of education if we're completely determined by our social surroundings and can never get out? This is the danger you were talking about.
Yeah.
So it's by encountering these texts that we actually are able to have more human interactions with other people, because our own conscience has been expanded, as has that of others.
Yeah. A liberal education, in my view, is premised on the notion of human freedom. It is the kind of education that is appropriate to a free individual, free subject. And that means that a liberal education presumes the capacity of self-transcendence. That is, a liberal education presumes the capacity in the student to overcome the limitations and the determinations of birth and class and gender and society. It is because we are capable of self-transcendence. It is because we are capable of activating our own freedom that we are subjects of liberal education. That is, that we are capable of liberal education. Liberal education presumes that in the individual, and liberal education cannot be done except under the recognition and presumption of human freedom.
And I would add that by human freedom, you are not saying freedom from any and all constraints or freedom, frankly, from any limitations put on you by your social location. I think part of the reason that I resonate so much with the notion of freedom that you have espoused is that, again, without denying the advantages or disadvantages one's social location can give you. I have seen with so many people that I have studied and worked with in Haiti or in Central America, in my own family and our immigrants, that the human person has a conscience that desires freedom and that can transcend the social location. Again, not to ignore all of the other things, but we must affirm that that is educating that human person's conscience is, as Jacques Maritain, one of my favorite philosophers, says, it's the means and the ends of education. What is education doing? Is it's shaping a whole person. And that's got to begin with that conscience that is created for freedom.
Absolutely.
So just to sort of wind down, I would actually love to continue this conversation. I feel like we have barely scratched the surface. We've covered some of the deeper philosophical questions about what a human person is. We've talked a little bit about the content of the Columbia curriculum, how you encountered it. But what we haven't gotten into, and perhaps we can leave this for a different conversation, is how does this apply outside of the Ivy Leagues? Again, we talk about privilege, but if you've gotten into the Ivy League, you're already very privileged in so many ways. But I know that you're really working to bring this approach to community colleges, to universities in Latin America, to institutions of higher education that are primarily serving minorities or people who will be going into what are broadly thought of as blue-collar jobs, not intellectual jobs, right? But yet you have a very well thought out approach to this, but maybe we'll leave that for another time. But what I want to leave our listeners with today is a bit of a reflection on the present moment. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, the questions we are discussing are universal and will be available on Scala's YouTube channel for people long into the future, I hope. But right now, we're doing this on Zoom because we're unable to meet in person because of the COVID crisis, the coronavirus. And in these times, I wanted to ask kind of, what is the value of this kind of liberal education when one feels like one is living in a crisis that is almost akin to a national, really an international health crisis? What is the value of a liberal education in this moment?
This crisis, as crises often do, has brought into greater focus our own humanity. The frailty of our humanity, the fragility of our humanity, the defining feature of our life, which is our mortality, the centrality of bonds and human connection in our sense of self. We are right now, as we record this, in a period of social isolation. Right, many states have mandated self-quarantines, stay-at-home orders, social distancing. These things, we are feeling the profound impact that they're having on the way that we experience the world, and our craving, our need for community and for human contact. These are the great human questions, and our education ought to be our liberal education. That is that portion of the education that is not just about earning money, but about our own humanity. That education ought to be focused on these very same questions. Many of us have found solace in this time of crisis in returning to some of those books. I've been rereading Boccaccio's Decameron and the experience of the plague and the kind of burst of humanity and humanism that the Black Death in Europe occasions, and which Boccaccio explores with those just exuberant, funny, full of life and full of flesh stories of the Decameron. We are finding solace in community. Since we have been in pseudo quarantine, probably the most satisfying 2 hours of my time have been the 2 hours I spent on Thursday with my students, talking on Zoom, but talking about our own experiences and trying to come to terms with what was happening and what it meant for us to be studying great books at this time and in this moment. So I think that this human crisis brings into relief the very values and questions that our liberal arts education is concerned with. And those of us who have access to a liberal education I think, find ourselves with an extra set of tools that we wouldn't have to deal with this situation had we not had that liberal education.
That's a wonderful answer. I will just direct people to Scala's website, where I have posted an article, a blog I wrote recently on C.S. Lewis's, it was actually a series, an oration he gave at St. Mary of the Virgin in Oxford in 1939, just after England had entered the Second World War. And the essay was called On Learning in Wartime. And I reread that essay to help me get through this time of crisis, being cut off from my community and my schedule upended. And Lewis makes several points, but one of the points he makes is that even in wartime or even in times of crisis, we don't cease being fully human. So what I have thought about this crisis is that it would be silly to think that anybody's schedule is going to go on as it always has, and just everything we were doing before we're now doing on Zoom and ignore what's going on. No. We have to pay attention to the crisis. We have to be informed. But we're still human beings. And Lewis makes this point that if we don't feed our minds with good literature and good ideas, we will be deformed. And so I think part of what's happening, because there's so much social media and so much news, I want to encourage people to take some of this time of self-isolation for actual solitude with great books, and not just absorb ourselves in the 24/7 news cycle, because it would be very tempting to do that. So, and I think what Lewis's point is that the life of the mind requires fighting distractions. And in a time of crisis, you have to really practice fighting those distractions. So just as an example, I got together the Scala alumni from the 3 past summer seminars. We did a Zoom call last week, and we talked about Lewis's essay. We talked about how we're doing. And we're launching a reading group on Zoom on Dante's Divine Comedy, something yours truly has never read. And when I got really tired of screen time, I sat down this weekend with Dante and a notebook. And for the first time in a long time, it was like being a freshman in college when I didn't have a laptop. It was me and a book and a pad of paper. But in some ways, I was deeply in solitude. But in that deep solitude with my great book and my notebook, it dawned on me, I'm having a great conversation with Dante, because in some ways, this object he created called the Divine Comedy is an expression of the man, the actual historical man named Dante. And it's a set of ideas and concepts. But the point being, like, even in our solitude, we can have these great conversations with the great books. People who are imprisoned can have great conversations with great books and great authors. People who are not in a 4-year college, people who got a 4-year college degree and didn't get a liberal education. The great books are things you can pick up. Now, I long for community, and I'm searching for a community to better understand Dante, but I want to encourage anybody out there who has not had the benefits of a formal great books education, and tell them that you can do this. You can all do this. You might need a guide, you might need a reading guide, you might need a community, but find out what's being taught in the great books and pick one up right now, and let that enrich your mind and deepen your soul. And then when you are responding to the crisis in whatever way, I think you'll see that you're responding to the crisis from a deeper place of understanding our own humanity, as you said.
That's right. I could not agree more. Let's give some thought, not just to what's happened the last 24 hours, but the last 24 centuries.
Well, on that note, I am so grateful for your time this morning, and I would love to continue this conversation. I feel like it's only just begun, and we'll find another time to do this again. But again, I want to thank our audience for listening. I want to encourage people to look up your articles. You have a wonderful article in Inside Higher Ed on the importance of liberal arts education for everybody. You've published in the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I've written on the Scala blog and on Margarita Mooney about education. I have an article in Real Clear Policy. So let's keep this conversation going. Thank you so much for your time today, Roosevelt.
Pleasure to talk to you, Margarita.
Bye-bye.
Bye.